they had gone to Park and Center to that if he had a good day, if he had a good day, he could go back to this park. So he went to that park. It's a good park. So yeah, if you're up for it, it would definitely make it so you to go there.
Yeah, that was the one Marshall was talking about.
Yep, I called you out, Dave.
You know what's funny is, on the way back after memorial service yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
we're listening to our local from Kansas City, and then she goes, let's listen to Flagstone's sermon.
Yeah.
And so we're listening all of a sudden, and there was this one guy, and Gene looks at me and I'm going, oh man, why don't you just shut up my name?
I didn't call you by name.
I know, but everybody in this class knew exactly.
But we're glad you're here.
Exactly.
And I'm telling you, there's several guys online too that make comments and stuff. So we'll go ahead and get started. I know there's a couple more people. I've already got one text that said, they're on their way. So we got a couple more people coming in. But we're going to go ahead and get started with our class today. Thank you for joining us. If you're online, thank you for joining us as well. Got a text from Brandon this morning that he and Morgan have been fostering some kids for, I don't know, months now. And they had a court date. I don't know if it's today, if it's anyway, found out this morning that they had to be at court at 9:30 this morning. So he's not running the computer today. So things are happening and I'm running things from up here. So if you're online, if you're getting on Facebook or on YouTube, you're welcome to make comments. I would love for you guys to comment with each other. I'm just not going to be able to see your comments live, but if you got questions or anything, you can put those in the comments. And I mean, if you want to, you can just, well, that's a good question. I don't even know if you can. You know what? You can just get on our yeah, you can just get on Facebook, Dave, if you want to.
Yeah, on my iPad.
Yeah, and just see if somebody comments on something, and just read it out to any of y'all can do that. I'll do that. I'll ask her once in a while, hey, has anybody made a comment or a question? Y'all can let me know. Anyway, so to get started this morning, we are let's see, what's today, the 14th? So we are basically a week away from the official start of fall. In 90-degree weather, we're a week away from the official start of fall. So my question first off this morning is, just first off, how many of you like fall? Is it a good season for you, or are you like, let's just move on to winter, or let's stay in summer? How many of y'all actually like fall?
I look forward to it. No more mowing.
No more mowing, she says. All right.
In spring, year round.
Do what now?
I want to stay in spring.
You want to stay in spring year round. You'll deal with fall, but you prefer the spring. Yeah.
It could be fall and spring year round.
Yeah.
I can enjoy fall
Uh-huh.
a lot because I like the weather, I like the colors, but I just know that winter's right
Yeah.
around the corner. So
Yeah.
I don't really get to enjoy it to the fullest. Every time there's a little cold snap, I'm like, oh no.
Yeah. It's coming. Fall's here, and then winter's coming. That's right. You said you like fall, Stephanie?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you like it better than winter?
Yes.
Okay.
I do. Yeah. It feels too short here because it stays so warm for so late.
Yeah.
And it gets cool fast and stays cold.
Yeah, it seems like our fall doesn't last as long as some other people's falls do. You're exactly right about that. So there, are some people, as soon as they find out that Starbucks is bringing back pumpkin spice, that's just the indication. Is that you? Yeah. That's
Jamie
the.
in Madrid says I love fall.
Jamie says she loves fall. That's, well, living in Fayetteville, or I know Jamie, she grew up in Boonville. There's some pretty trees to look at, pretty mountains to look at during the fall season. I like fall simply for, it's football season now. I'm so excited about that. I've been just waiting for it, which is odd because I never played football growing up, but man, that's become like my favorite sport. And so I'm going to watch my son play on Friday, and then watching a Razorback game on Saturday, and then whatever NFL game I choose to watch on Sunday. Whew, that's good. I'm liking it. So, What is one of the things? So if you like fall, or even if it's not your favorite, Sherry, what's something that you enjoy about fall though? Cooler temps, eventually anyway. I feel like this is one of the warmer Septembers we've had in a long time. Like, I know it gets warm in September, but this is like, we're still in the 90s, halfway through the month. That seems odd. So what's something else?
Getting back into routine. After the summer, something is refreshing about getting back into the swing of things.
Yeah, because summer you get kind of thrown off, doing different trips or different things, and fall kind of brings some more normalcy to it. For sure.
Regular programs coming back.
Is blue blood ever coming back?
So, is Blue Blood ever coming back?
About 4 of them came back.
Yeah, I don't even know what season that show's on now. I've never watched a single episode. I mean, I used to watch all Magnum P.I. when I was growing up, so that's my Tom Selleck. Would I? Okay.
They're a family.
That could be another discussion now. What's the TV show to watch? So new episodes. So you're tired of reruns, and you're tired of like filler shows until the new episodes start. Okay, Shelley, we're talking about what we like about fall.
Oh, wait a minute, can I say what I don't like about fall?
I guess.
Leaves.
Shelley just said she loves the leaves of fall. You said that's the thing you like least about it.
Stuck raking them out.
Yeah. Once they all come off the trees, that's miserable. I'm with you. I had the house we've lived in for 20 years had just a little, what do we have? A little crabapple tree. So not a ton of leaves that come off of it. But the worst part about a crabapple tree is the crabapples. Man, and when those things, I finally figured out, this is what I had to do the last few years. I finally figured out the best way to do it. I would buy a tarp, just a huge tarp, and I would lay it, under the tree, and then I'd just start shaking branches and letting all the crab apples fall. And I'm like covered in mushed up crab, because you have to wait till they get ripe enough for them to actually fall. But just shaking the branches and they all fall off, and just keep moving the tarp around the tree, and then, kind of roll it up and get one of my boys. I mean, it's a huge amount of crab apples. It looks like we're loading a dead body into the truck, but I would just load it in and just come over here to the dumpster and throw it in the dumpster. So that's one thing that I'm not going to miss about when we move into our new house.
Come by my house and shake the tree to get all those silly pine cone needles and
Oh, man.
having it cut down.
I can't stand pine trees. Our neighbors have pine trees, and it seems like all the needles fall into our yard.
All the needles and then plus all the pine cones.
Mm-hmm.
It's year round.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, doesn't matter.
I've got a man coming to cut, and it's easy. When I bought the house, because I had all these trees on the farm, I thought, no trees, no big ugly trees.
Yeah.
Black walnut or anything.
Mhm.
And after I bought it, I had missed that tree. How I missed it, right on the corner. Of
Yeah.
this thing. But I didn't. I said, oh no, there is a big tree.
And now you've had to deal with the pine needles all this time. Yeah, it's miserable. I can't stand pine trees. Okay, and it seems like for our neighbors, it was always during the summer. All the pine needles, like it's supposed to be an evergreen, right?
It's year round.
There's needles always in our yard, and you can't mow all those things up, and ugh. Now you get me started, Sherry. I just tell you what. Anyway, it's awesome to have the changing of the seasons. It's awesome to move through, different times of life, and so I on the way in this morning, even with it being 80 or 90 degrees, the leaves are starting to change. Have y'all noticed that? Which is just weird. It's like the reds and the oranges are coming out, and I'm still sweating to death. So it's just an odd time. But anyway, that's not what we came here to talk about today, is it? So let's go ahead and open up to either Exodus chapter 20 or Deuteronomy chapter 5. We've been going through the 10 Commandments. We're going to continue that today with commandment number 7. So I'm going to be reading from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 18, which simply says, "You shall not commit adultery." Now, when we talked about the commandment before this last week, you shall not murder. Seemed pretty simple, pretty straightforward, right? Don't kill somebody. Okay, done. Check. Got that one. And this feels like a pretty simple command as well, right? Don't commit adultery. Okay, got it. It doesn't seem that complicated, right? So go back again to what we talked about last week, when we have rules that are given to us, sometimes there's an expectation, hey, this might become a problem. But sometimes why do rules have to be enforced? Why do we have to come up with the rules in the first place?
Someone was doing.
Because yeah, exactly. We had to come up with the rules sometimes to deal with what's already started happening. Okay, and I think that kind of applies to what we're talking about here. So when we look at this command and God's saying don't commit adultery, I think part of the reason that he's saying it is not just looking forward to where the Israelites are heading when they get into the Promised Land, but it's probably already become, a problem to this point. And as we think about, let's look at the two parts of that. When we think about where they're headed, they've been in Egypt for 400 years. They've been in slavery, and now God has used the 10 plagues. He's brought them out of the wilderness. He's brought them out of slavery into the wilderness. And they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and now from the Deuteronomy version of this, they're getting ready to go into the Promised Land. Moses is going back through the laws again and saying, okay, let's remind ourselves of God's covenant and who we're supposed to be before we go into this new land that God has given you. So as they're getting ready to go, why would one of the things that God would want his people to be mindful of, and kind of one of the core commands for them, these 10 commandments, one of those being don't commit adultery? Why would that be important to them, knowing where it is that they're headed?
Because they're going into adulterous nations.
Okay.
Adulterous nations that worship other gods besides the one true God.
Right. So that was part of the first commands about having no other gods, having no idols, all those kinds of things. You're going to be living right in the middle of a bunch of nations who do have idols and who do have other gods. So don't be like them. Okay. So the same principle applies. You're going to a nation who, they have maybe adulterous affairs. Maybe they have different traditions and different customs when it comes to marriage relationships and things like that. So before you ever get there, I'm going to tell you ahead of time, don't commit adultery. But then there's also the issue that this may have already been a problem for the Israelites. Does anybody, do you know any stories from the Old Testament? I know we kind of breeze through the Old Testament sometimes and don't like all the stories, but there is a significant story in the book of Numbers about the people struggling as a whole with adultery. Does anybody remember this? I didn't write down the chapter, and I apologize for that. Well, that's in the New Testament for sure. That's in Jesus' day. Yeah, there was a woman that Jesus talked to that had 5 husbands, and the man that she was with at the time that Jesus met her wasn't her husband. So
You have King David also.
you have David. Yeah, you definitely have David for sure.
I swear I'm innocent.
Yeah. That's kind of his attitude. I did not have. You're going to start doing Bill Clinton's speech. I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. So, but even I'm talking about even before what Moses shares here in Deuteronomy. While the people were in the wilderness, there was a big problem, and I apologize for not writing the chapter number down. It's in the book of Numbers.
They made gold, bull out of gold. They made all that, and there was relations going on between everybody.
Yeah, while they were worshiping the golden calf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Golden calf, and then all of a sudden Moses comes down and looks at all this debauchery,
Mm-hmm.
worshiping the golden calf, and he's going, no, don't you think God knew what was going on?
For sure he knew what was going on. That's why he told them, you need to go down right now because these people have already messed up as he's giving him the commandments. So let me timeline this a little bit. In Exodus chapter 20 is where you get the 10 commandments the first time. And that is when Moses is up on Mount Sinai, and while he's getting the law, if you read the next couple of chapters after that, I can't remember for sure what chapter it is when it talks about the golden calf, but they make this idol. They think, Moses may never come down from this mountain, so let's make us another idol like all these other nations. And they do. And Scripture even says they sat down to eat and got up to commit revelry, I think is the way that one, or engage in revelry. However, it's I remember the word revelry. There in Exodus, they just got up to just do all these awful things. And Moses comes down. God tells you need to head down the mountain, and he does with these commands, with his law in his hands. And then he sees what the people are doing, and he just, throws down the tablets and breaks them. Part of that was out of his anger and frustration. Part of it was those stone tablets that had these commands written on them it was a contract. It was a covenant. God was saying, here's what I need from you. I'm going to be your God. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to bless you. And these commands, this is what I'm going to require from you. Well, they've already broken it. So it wasn't just anger on Moses' part. It was, these things are worthless because we've already broken these commands. Okay. So they had to deal with that. Then if you read through Numbers, they get to the Jordan River, and Moses sends spies into the new promised land to look at it. Y'all remember this story? And 12 of them go look, go everywhere. Look, it's awesome. It's wonderful. They come back and tell all the people, like, it's amazing. There's vegetation. We can grow crops. Our animals will be well fed. It's just this amazing land that God's given us. But we can't take it because the people that are there are too powerful. There's no way we're going to be able to take this land. Okay. And, they convinced the rest of the Israelites, like, we can't go into the promised land. We can't take it. And so, what was the punishment for that?
40 more years. 40 years.
You're going to wander around in this desert. Fine. You don't want to go in the promised land? Okay, stay in the desert for 40 years until this particular group of people all dies off. And then I'll let your kids go, except for Joshua and Caleb. Rachel, can you shut that door for me, please? So then, yeah, that's right. So in that 40 years, if you read through Numbers, a little bit of Leviticus, maybe even a little bit of Deuteronomy, but definitely in the book of Numbers, you find out different things that happen with God's people. It's not just numbering the number of people who are a part of the nation. There's other things that happen in the book of Numbers. And one of the things that's talked about is the nation of Moab, which was on the east side of the Jordan River where the Israelites would have been. There's a guy that was king. His name was Balak, and he hires a guy named Balaam to come pronounce curses on the people. Y'all remember Balaam? What's the significant thing about Balaam? He was riding on a donkey, and the donkey could see the angel in the road, and Balaam couldn't, and the donkey kept going different directions, and then Balaam got mad and was beating the donkey, and the donkey started talking to him, saying, "Why are you beating me?" And Balaam answers, and it's this whole... Anyway, so, God didn't want Balaam to go. He's hired to go and curse God's people, and he tells Balak, I've got to only say what God allows me to say or tells me to say. And so he goes and he's on this mountainside above all the Israelites. They're down in the valley. And instead of cursing them, what does he do? He blesses them 7 different times. Okay. And so that's where most of us feel like the story ends. But if you pay attention, the next thing that happens after that is a bunch of Israelites end up hooking up with a bunch of Moabite women. And some of them they marry, and some of them they just have sex with. But they're right next to the nation of Moab, and they start flirting with these girls, and they start having these affairs with these women that God said, I don't want you intermarrying, I don't want you connecting in that way with any other nations, because they're going to lead you away from me, right? And yet they did anyway. And God sends a plague against his people because they did this. Well, y'all forgive me. This is in Numbers, and I'm feeling so bad that I didn't write this down. So I'll look it up later and maybe post it. So, update. Hey, this is where I was talking about today, because you find out later that Israel ends up having a battle against the Moabites, and guess who dies in the battle? Balaam does, because he was still with the Moabites, and it was actually his idea for these Moabite women to go and tempt the Israelite men. And so it ended up causing a problem for God's people, and it was Balaam's idea to make all that happen. Okay? So somewhere in that 40-year time is when, of wandering around the wilderness, is when that happened. Y'all with me? Now we're at the end of the 40 years, and Moses is getting ready to send the Israelites into the promised land. And he starts off by going, okay, you remember those commandments when we were by the mountain, when we were, out in the wilderness? Let's go through those again. So now, commandment number 7 is what? You shall not commit adultery. Well, there's two parts. I'm coming full circle now. There's 2 parts to this. I don't want you to commit adultery because the people that you're going to go be living around, they do those kinds of things, and I don't want you to be like them. But let's also be mindful of, you've already had a problem with this. And look at the consequences of that. It wasn't just an affair. There was plagues that came. There was all this other problems that came because you chose to engage in this activity. Let's not even go down that road. Y'all see that? Okay? So this isn't just God going, you know what? It's probably a good idea not to have adultery. It's part of the identity that he wanted for his people. I don't want to see you do this, and I don't want other people to see you as a people who do this. Does that make sense? Okay. So just to look at the command in a little bit more detail. So this part of the Bible was written originally in ancient Hebrew. So if you go back to the original Hebrew language, the word that's used for adultery is probably used, I'm going to say, at least 30 some odd times throughout Scripture, and a lot of times we think of adultery as the same thing as sexual immorality, which they can be the same, but there's 2 different Hebrew words for those things. Okay, and so there's different sexual activities that were just immoral, that were just against God's design. And there's one Hebrew word for that, and then there's specifically a Hebrew word for adultery. Okay? And so this Hebrew word literally meant to have sex with someone that you're not married to. But it was only used to refer to having sex with someone not only that you're not married to, but they are married to someone else. Does that make sense? So this Hebrew word didn't apply, not that God wanted it, but it didn't apply to unmarried people. So in other words, if a married man had sex with an unmarried woman, that was sexually immoral, but it wasn't adultery. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm saying I'm not saying it wasn't adultery. I'm saying just the Hebrew word that's used. This word that's used when God says don't commit adultery is specifically about a married person having sex with another married person that they're not married to. Everybody with me? Okay. And that's important because of when we fast forward to Jesus' day with the Jewish people and seeing what they were doing with this command. Okay. So when God says don't commit adultery, well, and adultery is just a married man having sex with a married woman that he's not married to. I mean, how serious was that? What was the here in the 10 Commandments, we don't have any punishments listed. What was the consequences? Yeah. So if you go back to the book of Leviticus and look in Leviticus, I believe it's chapter 20. Yes, ma'am. It's a good question. I'm going to answer that. Give me just a second. Yeah. So look in Leviticus chapter 20. Leviticus, a couple of books before Deuteronomy. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 10 says, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. So, according to the law, what was the consequences for committing adultery? For who? For both, okay? Both the man and the woman were supposed to be put to death, okay? And usually that was death by stoning. All right, so that's the rule. Now, what ended up happening, this isn't necessarily what God said, but what ended up happening was there was typically more punishment for the woman than there was a man. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying that's what happened. Okay? You see the law itself saying it's supposed to be both of them. But you see, in practice, you see the women usually having more consequences than the men did. And you even see that a little bit in just determining if an affair had taken place. Okay? So if you go to, I've already mentioned the book of Numbers. You go to the book of Numbers chapter 5, God gave a whole test for determining whether someone had been unfaithful or not. Okay? Let me go back there myself. In Numbers chapter 5, there's this test for adultery. And it specifically talks about for a test for the woman to see if she's had an affair or not. Now, part of it was you had to be, like anything else, you had to be accused by at least 2 or 3 witnesses. Who's witnessing this? I don't know. But if somebody, or, maybe a guy, kind of, if you think about Joseph and Mary, Jesus' parents, if, the guy thinks that this woman that he's engaged to even has been, because in Jewish culture, even engaged people were considered to be married. I mean, you couldn't have, if this girl's engaged to this guy, I can't have sex with this girl because that's the same thing as committing adultery. Even though they haven't gone through the wedding ceremony yet, they're engaged, they're connected to each other. Does that make sense? So if you were worried about that ahead of time, or if you thought, if you get on into Deuteronomy Chapter 24 and there's laws about divorce and stuff, and you think that this woman that I'm married to has been having an affair with somebody else, this is one of the ways to prove it. So you would take her to the priest, and there's this whole process. I won't read through the whole thing, but she brings grain, and there's they take the grain and they write down the sin on a scroll, and they pour water over that, and the ink runs into this other water, and they give her this just this concoction basically to drink. And when she drinks it, then if she is pregnant, man, we're having a bunch of different ringtones today. All got different ones.
Get your warranty on your truck. Those come through.
Oh, well, make sure you get that taken care of. So, but if she drinks it, if she gets sick, or what they said, she becomes distended, like her abdomen would swell, or if she was pregnant, it would cause a miscarriage, and that's how you would prove that she had been sexually active with this person. If nothing happened, then she's innocent. Okay? So that was part of the process. Again, I know we look at that now going, oh my gosh, that's just brutal. But that's the process that they used back in that time. So there's nothing written in Scripture about proving whether or not a man had been sexually unfaithful or not. Okay? I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's the way it is. Okay? So I think the bigger issue is the law, or the consequences that are talked about in Leviticus. When these two people have had an affair, both of them are supposed to be put to death. That was the law. Now, as you go through, 1,500 years of history, and you get to Jesus' day, they weren't, the practice for the most part in Jesus' day wasn't always stoning. Sometimes they do strangulation. Sometimes they'd burn people at the stake. I mean, there was like different kinds of things, and stoning wasn't always the process. Now, we obviously see stoning in the New Testament. I mean, we talked about the woman that gets brought to Jesus in the temple in John chapter 8. Y'all remember that story? She'd been caught in adultery, and they bring her to Jesus, and they say, the law says we should stone her. we see later on in Acts when a guy named Stephen is preaching, and the Jews don't like what he's preaching. They drag him outside and stone him. So there is still stoning taking place in Jesus' day. It just wasn't as common. They would use other methods for whatever that's worth. Okay. But when you get to, I want to kind of look at where this law had gotten to in Jesus' day. Well, let me pause for a second there. I got so much stuff here that I want to share with you guys in just so little time. You mentioned, Dave, David and Bathsheba. Let's remind ourselves of the story. You got King David, right? Married? Yes or no? Yes. Actually, multiple wives. So he was definitely married, okay? And you got this woman Bathsheba. Was she married? Yes. Okay. David's on the roof of his palace. He looks down and sees Bathsheba bathing. And actually her husband is out fighting a war for him. So that makes it awkward. Do what? Yeah. Her husband is an honorable guy. He's actually one of David's mighty men. He's like this isn't somebody that David's like, I don't even know who this woman is, much less her husband. No, they were really good friends. They had fought in battles side by side. This is like part of David's special forces, So they had a connection. They had a relationship with each other already. Anyway, he brings Bathsheba to the palace. They end up having sex. She goes home. Sometime later, she finds out I'm pregnant. He wants to make it look like it's Uriah's. So he calls Uriah in, thinking that he'll come in from the battlefield and want to go home and spend quality time with his wife. And he doesn't. He stays at the palace. And, David even tries to get him drunk. So he'll just end up just out of habit stumbling home and having sex with his wife. And then everybody will think that it's his baby. And he still doesn't. He just sleeps at the palace. And so David ends up sending a note back with Uriah to the commander of his army saying, hey, put Uriah at the front of the battle. And then everybody withdraw and we'll make sure that he gets killed. And that's what happens. And then David marries Bathsheba. And then they're like, oh, look, she got pregnant really fast. And, she has this baby. Yeah. So that was the whole plan. And David, I guess, thought that he got away with it. Okay. And then, the prophet Nathan comes to him, confronts him about it, and he's sorry for it. The baby that she has ends up dying. But they stay married and they have another baby named Solomon, and the story goes on from there. Okay. When Nathan confronts David, and David is honest, he's like, you're right, I sinned against God. I mean, if you read Psalm 51, that is David's confession. God, I have sinned against you. I have messed up. The things that I said I would never do, I've done. I need a do-over. And God forgives him, which is awesome. If anybody ever tells you there's no stories about grace in the Old Testament, they are flat out wrong. There's a ton of grace talked about in the Old Testament, okay? And this is one of them. But what was supposed to happen to David and Bathsheba? They're supposed to be stoned to death. There's no doubt. She got pregnant, okay? There's pretty substantial proof that they had sex with each other, all right? And so according to the law, they were both supposed to die, and yet they didn't. So while there's the law and there's consequences, the consequences weren't always practiced. And they weren't always practiced consistently. And like I said, sometimes the men got away with it and the women didn't. And for whatever reason. Okay?
Isn't that true in today's society?
About men and women?
No, about rich and powerful versus common man.
For sure.
I mean, there's nothing different.
Yeah. Yeah, the people in power often get away with things that they're not supposed to get away with. Or they find loopholes or things like that.
And David wasn't even doing what he was supposed to be doing anyway. He should have been out fighting.
He should have been with the kings fighting wars, and he wasn't even where he was supposed to be. Yeah. So I'm showing you all of those things to say, it seems like such a simple law. Don't do this. Okay. And yet, the law gets broken a lot, and sometimes there are consequences to it, and sometimes there weren't. And that's human nature too. But what God wanted for his people was to keep the marriage bed pure and to keep it between those two married people. Okay? Now let's fast forward to Jesus' day. So we looked at Matthew chapter 5 last week when we were talking about murder. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 5 again. Yes, ma'am.
Before you go further,
Yes, ma'am.
but having multiple wives wasn't considered adultery?
So, no, because they were married. So in Genesis chapter 2, the question was having multiple wives was not considered adultery. No, because they went through the process of getting married. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 says, for this reason, man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. You see, from the very beginning, God's design was for a man to marry a woman. You read through the rest of Genesis, I mean, how many wives did Jacob have? He had 2 for sure, and then the other 2 concubines that I guess technically were considered his wives. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. David had at least 6 wives I can think of. I think he had 6. So you read through the Old Testament, all these different guys. I mean, Moses had 2 wives. One that he had before he went to Egypt to get the Israelites out, and then another wife that he got while they were out there in the wilderness. It doesn't seem, I don't necessarily want to go too far down this road this morning. It doesn't seem that God's command or design was for multiple spouses, but God allowed that to take place. Does that make sense? Not that he allowed it, but I mean, not does it make sense that he did, but there's accommodations that God made. For example, when Jesus is questioned about divorce in the book of Matthew, and they're saying, talking about this woman, they're given this scenario, this woman having multiple husbands and stuff, and Jesus brings up divorce. He says, the whole reason, and you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, where Moses says, if you're going to divorce a woman, here's the process. You have to have the certificate written out. There's this whole process for that happening. And Jesus says, they bring up, Moses said that we could have a certificate of divorce. And that if a man wanted to put away his wife, he needs to give her a certificate of divorce. And Jesus says, you know why God did that? Because you're going to do it anyway. God's design was never for there to be a divorce. If you read in the book of Malachi, God says, I hate divorce. Not I hate divorced people, but I hate divorce. That was never what God intended. But Jesus says, he says, your hearts were hard. And so God gave you, since you're going to leave this woman high and dry anyway, then we're going to make it legal. And we're going to have this certificate, and she's going to be able to marry somebody else so that she can be taken care of. If you're not going to be man enough to do it yourself, is basically what he's saying. Okay? So it was never God's intent for divorce to happen. But since mankind, and especially God's people, were going to do it, then he said, okay, then let's do it this way. So, to me, by the same principle, it was never God's intent for a man to have 700 wives. But God's like, well, you're going to do it anyway, so let's go through the marriage process and let's be married to these women, and let's be faithful to the ones that you have. Huh? I know. You get that whole process as well. Well, for sure, a lot of times, the question being, why would you want that many wives? For sure, the 700, basically 1,000 women that Solomon had in his life, holy cow. I know. I'm not going to say. I'm like, you think about it, just in any kind of relationship, just trying to meet the needs of that person. You got 700. Anyway, a lot of those were either for it could be for like a treaty, political, like a treaty. It could be a gift from that some king. When they would come and bring gifts to Solomon, they would also give him women. Take this woman as your wife, and so it opened up trade routes between Israel and other countries. I mean, and that's so foreign to our culture nowadays. but it made sense back then. And so that, a lot of times that's what it was just we're going to be partners, we're going to be friends. And part of the way that we prove that is I'm taking this woman from your nation and I'm marrying her. And as long as I've got her, we're going to be at peace with each other. Yes, ma'am.
Was there that shortage of men or surplus of women?
It's a good question. I don't know. I have no idea if there's a shortage of men or a surplus of women. I'm not for sure. We have come so far, rightfully so, in advancing just the human rights of women. I know there's more to be done, okay? But I'm just saying, if you look back at different cultures, just at Scripture, but you can look at other cultures around the world. Go through your history classes and look at, stuff over in the Asian continent and different things in African continents. There's all sorts of different accepted practices when it comes to marriage and especially the treatment of women. But I think I can kind of bring that all together because I think that's part of what Jesus was getting at in his ministry of really trying to empower women more so than they have been for centuries before. Okay? And I think we can see that even with what we're going to look at in Matthew chapter 5. So if you go to Matthew chapter 5 in the New Testament, this is in what Jesus was talking about, the Sermon on the Mount that we talked about last week. Okay? Matthew chapter 5, let me turn there myself, and verse 28 is what we're going to look at. Verse 27. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. Okay, we just learned that, right? That's in the law. You've heard that. He's talking to Jewish people. You've heard this since you were kids. Don't commit adultery. Okay? But I tell you, verse 28, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, as a man thinketh, so is he, right? That's a little bit different than what Moses said back in Deuteronomy. And it's important that Jesus makes the distinction. Okay? Goodness, we're already most of the way through class time. What do you know already, or what would you assume when Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery? And I'm sorry, I'm interrupting myself. Most of Matthew chapter 5, multiple times Jesus says, you've heard it was said, but I tell you. Okay? And basically, he's looking at, you've been taught this law, or you've been taught this version of the law. Let me tell you what God really intended when he gave the law, or let me tell you what God really wants instead of the tradition that you've been handed down. Okay? So, if that's kind of the process that he's going through here, when he says, you've heard it was said, don't commit adultery, but I tell you, so that I know what you've heard, but let me tell you something different. What do you think has happened in the Jewish culture of Jesus' day when it comes to this law? It's a horrible way to ask that question. Maybe you can answer it anyway. What? Loopholes. What loopholes would you find as far as committing adultery is concerned? What?
Jews have rules for everything.
Yeah.
But you could do this, but on this day, like carrying wood would be forbidden on the Sabbath.
Right.
But are you putting it in to heat your room? But it's on a Sabbath, so I can't even heat my room.
Right.
There were loopholes. There were more rules. There were more rules on top of rules.
Right. There's a ton of rules and a ton of regulations, and then there's also ways to kind of skirt around the rules if we can figure out a way to do so. And Jesus even talks about that. You talked about Sabbath rules, Dave. Jesus even talks about, like, you're mad at me for healing somebody on the Sabbath, and yet if somebody's donkey falls in a hole, it's okay to pull that animal out. Which, how can healing a person be wrong and pulling a donkey out of or an ox or whatever it was out of a hole be okay? So there's inconsistencies for sure. What was happening in Jesus' day, as far as loopholes go, the rule is do not commit adultery. And man, we talked about like the mindset of how close can I get to the rule and not break it? How close can I get to the line and not go over it? I was reminded last week of a class I took my senior year at Harding, elementary stats, just statistics. I had to take it. I had to take some kind of math class. It was my next to last semester. Had to have it to graduate, so I took it. I took the easiest professor I possibly could, which was awesome. But at the end of the class, at the end of the semester, he posted outside his classroom. He didn't put names. He put your social security number, and then like what your grade was, and then he had like this whole chart. Like if you wanted an A in the class or being like, here's what you got to make on the final to get, whatever grade you wanted. So, they kind of created the mentality of like, well, if I just want this grade, I ain't got to study that hard. How close do I want to get to? How hard do I want to work to to get this grade? I might slide. Okay. Same thing was happening with the Jewish people of Jesus' day and even the religious leaders of Jesus' day. How close can we get to breaking the law without actually breaking it? So the rule was, do not commit adultery. Okay, that's a rule. How close can I get to that and not actually be committing adultery? So, in the mindset, especially of the men of Jesus' day, you could look, gawk, stare, fantasize, touch, grope, whatever, as long as you didn't have actual sexual intercourse with this person. And they could even take it a step further. I can have sex with somebody as long as she's not married. Because adultery is just married people, Now, and I see you shaking your head, Linda. Is that what God intended with the law? No. But that's what people in Jesus, because that's what we do. That's our human nature. How close can I get to breaking the rule without breaking the rule? And that's what was happening in Jesus' day. So he says, you've heard it was said, don't commit adultery. And he's talking to people and they're like, yeah. I haven't had sex with a married, a married person I'm not married to. I'm good. Jesus says, but I tell you, what's the rule? Don't even look at another person with lust in your heart. Don't even look at another person with just that desire. That's a significant difference. Okay? I want to be clear, this isn't about seeing somebody else and going, oh, that's an attractive person. This is when he talks about looking lustfully, that's the same word that's used in other parts of the New Testament, and we'll talk about this in a couple weeks. When we talk about coveting, when I see something that I want and I think on it and I crave it. Does that make sense?
A good word would be desire.
Yeah, I'm desiring it. I'm craving it. I want to have it. I keep thinking about it. I dwell on it. Jesus says, if a man looks at a woman and holds on to that desire and keeps thinking about it and craves it, even if he doesn't physically act on it, Jesus says, what has he already done? He's already committed adultery in his heart, because your heart doesn't know the difference. Okay? And there may have been no physical act, and I may be like, oh, well, then that's fine. Didn't break the law. And Jesus says that's not God's intent. When God gave the law, don't commit adultery, he wasn't just talking about just the physical act. He was talking about your heart. The same thing, same kind of principle when he says, when God said don't murder, he's not just talking about don't take somebody else's life. He's talking about don't let your anger get the best of you. Keep your anger in check where you don't even get to that point. Keep your desires and your lusts in check where adultery's not even, it's not even on the table. I'm not even anywhere close to that because I'm keeping my eyes, my thoughts in check ahead of time. Yes, ma'am.
So would pornography then be covered under that, even though it wasn't a real, even though it's not a person that you're in physical contact with or whatever?
I think so. I think that, is pornography the same as cheating on your spouse? not necessarily, because again, there's no physical act, and I do think the having physical sex with someone who you're not married to while you're married to somebody is just devastating, and I think I think that would be, not having experienced it, I think that would be more devastating than just the pornography itself. However, looking at videos and pictures and craving those things, lusting after those things, yeah, I think that's what Jesus is getting at there. You are desiring something, that and desiring someone else, that you're only supposed to have that desire for with your spouse. That was horrible grammar, but y'all understand what I'm saying. Like that desire is only for your spouse, which I think is why, pornography is just so dangerous.
It's addictive too.
Incredibly addictive. And it's not, it is more prevalent. It is a bigger temptation for men than it is for women, but y'all, I mean, you look at the statistics. There's a significant percentage of women in our culture that are addicted to pornography, just like men. And it's, I think that's why Jesus makes such a distinction there. Don't look at that other person with that kind of desire, because of what it can lead to. And the adultery, why did God not want you to have adultery in the first place? Because you're supposed to have that level of commitment and that level of intimacy where there's nothing hidden, completely open. I mean, when you have sex with another person, you got two naked bodies, you're seeing all the bumps and bruises and blemishes and everything, and we are completely open and honest with each other. It's the most intimate thing that you can do with another human being. And Jesus says, God's design was for husband and wife to share that. Don't have that level of intimacy with somebody else. Just have that with your spouse. When you start, even when we try to rationalize and justify and say, well, it's just images, it's just video, I'm not actually with that person. But your heart doesn't know the difference. And you are craving and desiring something that you're only supposed to have that kind of craving, that desire, that sexual desire for your spouse. It's contrary to what God designed for you. And it's hurtful. It's hurtful to this person that you said you're committed to have that kind of desire and that kind of lust for somebody else. Does that make sense? So I think that's why Jesus, I think that's why he was that direct with the people of his day, and why it still continues to apply to us nowadays. It's not just about having an affair. Now, are having affairs still a problem in our culture? For sure. Okay. I just looked up, this is from 2018. Let me wrap up here in a second. It said that 20% of men in our country and 13% of women reported that they had sex with someone other than their spouse while they were married. Just here in the United States. Yeah, and the study that I was reading was like, now, how many people are actually going to confess to this? So I don't know how the survey got conducted, but just this particular study was saying there's at least 20% of married men in this country and 13% of married women, and honestly, 18 to 29-year-olds, the rate of infidelity is slightly higher for women than it is for men. For whatever that's worth, I don't know why. When they get later on in life, then it flip flops, and once you get to about the 40-year-olds, then it switches, and men is significantly higher than women as far as who cheats on their spouses. And the only reason I bring those stats up, and I got more, I was looking at stuff and it just got depressing, so I quit looking at statistics. This is not something just from Old Testament times or Bible times. And this is not just something that people outside the church struggle with, okay? sexual sin is just as prevalent inside the church as it is outside of it. And it's just as strong a temptation. Now, I do think, as I need to wrap up this morning, I don't think that affairs, I don't think that pornography addictions, I don't think any of those things are unforgivable. I think God can forgive anything. I think spouses can forgive anything. May take some time, may take a lot of work. But it can be forgiven and moved past. There is grace. There is forgiveness. Thank God there is. We don't have to go out and stone people for making these kinds of choices. But the significance of it and the seriousness of it, we don't need to ever lose sight of that. From the get-go, God wanted his people to be faithful. And I think the final thing about, as far as just what the hurtfulness of adultery, when you go through, and why it was so important to God, when you go through 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, the prophets, and you read about Israel, you read about God's people and how they were worshiping other gods and how they were going against God's laws and adopting practices and cultures from other nations around them. Do you know what imagery God used more than any to talk about how he felt about what his people were doing? He felt like he was a jilted husband. He felt like, and he uses that terminology, and he talks about, Israel, you have gone and committed adultery against me. And God's hurt by it. Was he angry? For sure. But I mean, just read the book of Hosea. You know, God has Hosea, a prophet of his, go marry a woman who's probably going to cheat on him, knowing that ahead of time. And what does she do? She cheats on him, and she ends up getting pregnant from some other guy, because they end up naming that kid Not My People, because it wasn't Hosea's kid. So, you know, or Hosea has all this happen, and then he goes, like, she even leaves. She even leaves home, and she gets completely abandoned by all these guys that she's been having sex with. And Hosea goes and finds her and says, I want to marry you again, and I want you to come home with me, and I want you to be faithful to me, and I'm going to be faithful to you. And God basically uses that real life story to say, this is me. I have done nothing but love you and pour myself out for you, and you've gone after these other lovers. But you know what? I'll take you back. And I just want you to be faithful to me, and I'm going to be faithful to you. That is at the heart of why God gave the command to his people. Not just about it's not just about sexual promiscuity. It's about faithfulness. I want my people to reflect me and to be an image of me. And if they're going to wear my name, I want certain things to be known about them. And one of the things I want my people to be known for is their fidelity, their faithfulness. Not just to their spouses, but to me. And one of the ways we can demonstrate that is how faithful they are to the people that they're married to. So don't commit adultery. Not just because it's hurtful to the person you're married to or the spouse of that person that you're having sex with, because it's a poor reflection of me and of our relationship. Does that make sense? And I think that's still what God wants for his people today. I want you to be faithful, and I don't want you to lust after things. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to give you what you need. Don't crave and don't lust after other things. I'll take care of you. And man, whenever we start going down that path, it's not just about it just being icky and sinful. It says something about our connection with God and our relationship with him. Does that all make sense? Okay.
He compares the church.
Huh?
He compares the church to the bride.
Yeah, he calls the church his bride.
You know, that tells you how important marriage is to him, that he would use that as
Yeah.
an example.
Of all the things that he compares to, he calls us his bride. For sure. So, okay, I'll look later and see what other kind of comments or questions we had, if we had any on social media. But we'll be back again next Tuesday. Maybe Brandon will be back in the chair, and we're getting close to the end of the commandments. So I need y'all to start thinking about what you want to study next. We went through Proverbs this past spring, and then we started on the 10 Commandments. So if y'all want to do another book study, maybe we jump back over the New Testament and find something. Or if you want to find something in the Old Testament study, we'll do that too. So be thinking about that. That'll be in a few weeks when we start something new. Okay? All right. Thanks for your time today. Appreciate it, guys. Have a good rest of the week.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Don't commit adultery. If there's anything else to remember from this class, don't commit adultery.
We're gonna go eat too much.
Yeah, that's the adultery of the
Yeah.